And what AI really does is it's also a great equalizer. So, you want people who might not otherwise have the resources to work on this problem to do it. It can be a question of a few students somewhere around the world with a few laptops, and they could, download amazing large language models or other AI models from different platforms, and they can work and innovate, maybe just with a few people, and they can come up with amazing solutions to big problems. So we're big fans of open source. It's just for the overall capability and ability to advance the science and the technology, but also for, democratizing the access.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Artificial intelligence, AI, stands at the forefront of a technological revolution. So how do we regulate it without stifling the innovation that has brought us to this incredible place in time? Our podcast features insights from various perspectives, from industry leaders to government officials to advocacy groups from around the world. Together, they address pivotal questions that are needed to create fair and practical legislation. I'm very excited to have Patrik Gayer with us today. He's the head of global affairs for Silo AI, one of the largest private AI labs in Europe. He was also the AI and data policy lead for Tesla. I invited him on this show as it is very important to get many different perspectives towards framing AI legislation, and we need to get a global perspective on this transformative technology. Welcome, Patrik. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. It's a great honor to be here.
Wonderful. Patrik, we have a global audience. We have members of US Congress, members of the Senate, their staff, think tanks, industry around the world listening. Could you give our listeners an overview of Silo AI, its mission in the AI landscape? And then also, as the head of global affairs, what are your primary roles and responsibilities at the company?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So Silo AI is, as you mentioned in the intro, one of the largest private AI labs in Europe. Our mission is to ensure that Europe actually has an AI flagship company moving forward, and that's sort of the real mission we're working towards, working very hard towards every day. What we actually do is we build market-leading open source large language models at this point, with the overall intent to really enhance sort of European digital excellence, digital sovereignty, but also to democratize access to LLMs, which are definitely at the risk of sort of being concentrated into the hands of the few. We help our customers with anything from developing their own products and services based on AI. We do more of a sort of consulting approach, but we also now have our own growing product business. So we really work sort of full scale on AI from the research development part up to supporting companies with the deployment of AI. Now, to your second question, what I do and what my role is, I like to joke that we chose global affairs because it's vague enough that it can mean a lot of different things. My background is in the world of policy and the public sector. So of course, public policy, advocacy, and sort of compliance related matters are very much at the heart of what I do. But since we are very much a startup, it's sort of an all hands on deck kind of situation. So I also work a lot with strategic partnerships, particularly with the public sector, both on sort of collaborative projects, but also on trying to figure out what the best use cases and value generating use cases for AI can be in the public sector. And additionally, I do a little bit of work in the sort of communications and media relations space as well. So it's a full desk with a lot of things going on.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, Patrick. For our listeners who might not be as aware of what's happening in the AI sector in Europe, because we have listeners outside Europe, in North America, South America, Africa, and Asia, it's really heartening to note that AI is really thriving in Europe. So you talked about a couple of things, if I may follow up. Your focus, Patrick, is heavily on open sourcing of these large language models. There is, at least in the United States, there are two camps on whether open source, closed source, so to speak. If you see Facebook, they've got Llama now, Llama 3 is coming out. Actually, Google also now put their toe in the open source with Gemma, a model that they have announced. And then you have closed source with OpenAI, Microsoft, etc. Now, obviously, there are proponents that say, innovation thrives through open source, and that's where we come to. And then there are people who say, hey, we're going to give, especially when you give these weights and other models over, there are maybe nations and people who might not have the best intentions. Where do you come out on this whole argument of open source versus closed source?
So I think it's actually pretty simple for us to answer that question as a company. I mean, we are very big fans of open source. We're a company of about 300 people, over half of whom have PhDs in the field, very research heavy company. People used to working in a sort of very collaborative environment, in an open environment that is very pro innovation and trying to solve some of the, most difficult problems we as humankind face. And we firmly believe that open source is sort of at the heart of this, and the ability for us as humankind to solve these problems. It's going to be more likely that they will be solved through collaboration. And what AI really does is it's also a great equalizer, right? So you want people who might not otherwise have the resources to work on this problem to do it. It can be a question of a few students somewhere around the world with a few laptops, and they could, download amazing large language models or other AI models from different platforms, and they can work and innovate, maybe just with a few people, and they can come up with amazing solutions to big problems. So we're big fans of open source. It's just for the overall capability and ability to advance the science and the technology, but also for democratizing the access. Because if you go more of the sort of closed route, as some technology development over the last 20 years have gone, you do see a trend towards sort of power being centralized into the hands of the few. And I'm a political scientist by training myself, and generally speaking, in political science, when power is centralized, that's bad news. So it's also a good idea to fight back against sort of monopolies and the concentration and centralization of power by using open source methods. Now, of course, it's important to give the caveat. It's open source is not a business model. And to build a commercial business model, you also need to have proprietary technology, and you need to be able to provide added value to customers, as do we. But the foundational part, training these foundational models, we do that together with a university partner, and we are all in on open source. And maybe the last point I'll make on open source is that there's also different levels of open, right? And I think this term has become, in the past few, maybe months, maybe a year, it's also been used as a marketing tool. So a lot of companies like to say that they're open when you dig a little bit deeper, you see that, well, maybe they published their model on a platform, but they didn't say anything about the data or the model weights, or maybe they did. So I would also encourage your listeners to be very skeptical when they hear companies and different actors using the term open, and really sort of digging deeper into what they actually mean by it.
So again, you made some very important points for our listeners, especially policymakers, that open source will democratize AI, where somebody with sitting in a laptop anywhere, it could be in a small town in Iowa, it could be in a village in Finland or in Denmark or Norway, etc. Students working at a university will have access to this perspective, and this is really important for our policymakers who are struggling with this. But they also have been fed this notion that if they do this with, the weights and everything else, the training weights and things like that, it'll give bad actors the ability to create bio weapons and stuff like that. What do you say to that, to our policymakers who are, remember, they are not AI experts. They are getting this information, and they're getting it from you also. So what would be your answer to that, Patrik?
Sure. I mean, I've had numerous conversations about this topic with policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think the fear or the worry is very reasonable, and I don't want to sort of in any way negate it and say that it's something that we shouldn't think about. I just think it's important for us to sort of level set where we are right now with the technology and where we could be in a matter of 5 years or 10 years or something. Today's large language models, I mean, it's perhaps a little simplistic to just call them, prediction engines, but it's kind of what they are. They are, I mean, I don't think you can find any definition by which they are conscious or can act as agents independently. They are very much under the control of humans. And I mean, there has been really open source large language models that are very capable for about a year now, after the whole sort of ChatGPT craze, and we haven't seen any remarkable impact. So I think usually the burden of evidence is on the one making a claim, and if the claim is that open source AI models will lead to something X, whatever the scenario is, I do think that sort of we would have seen some signs of that. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't take this threat seriously. And I do believe that this is more a matter of enforcement and a matter of sort of oversight that government agencies can provide together, of course, in collaboration with industry. But at the end of the day, we really find ourselves at a situation where if this technology gets developed anyway somewhere and it's closed, the same threats in my mind are still there. It's just other people dealing with them. Now, if that development happens in the open, there is a collective effort and we are more aware. I mean, none of us knows what happens inside of OpenAI's development, whereas you can very openly follow what we and many others do just by going to Hugging Face and downloading the model card. And so I do think that, again, if we go the closed route for this reason, we anyway implicitly place a lot of faith in the companies at the forefront of this technological development without any government oversight.
So to our policymaker is saying is keep the innovation, but you could have oversight and enforcement to protect it from bad actors. Because anyway, if it is closed, we are dependent on the ethics and the values of these big companies, which sometimes has been questionable. So, Patrik, taking that question, you also touched on a very important topic that is currently being discussed and debated in the US Congress in light and in perspective of social media. Right now, the town halls of the world are dominated by 4, 5, 6 big tech companies. And the fear in the US Congress and around policymakers of the world is that the same thing should not happen to AI, because building large language models, as you've seen with your organization, is an expensive process, getting the GPUs, the talent, etc., and large companies can't do it. How do regulators make sure that we support this, they support this effort, but there is no monopolistic behavior? Because just last week we saw Mistral, which was a heavily open source company, has taken an investment from Microsoft. Now, maybe it's all good and everything is great, but my point here is it's large tech companies are basically investing even in these innovative early stage companies, whether it's an Anthropic and others. So your thoughts on monopoly and what can legislators here do about that?
Now, personally, I'm been very worried about sort of the development in the technology sector more broadly over the last few decades, and the concentration of sort of both power and wealth that has happened. I do think it has broad ranging implications that are sort of go far above and beside what maybe the purview of this conversation is.
Sure.
But more socioeconomic implications. And I think we've seen very strong evidence of that already happening. Now, in my mind, sort of the way policymakers should, in an ideal scenario, deal with this is, I mean, we have antitrust laws. We've had antitrust laws for the better part of over 100 years now. It's just that they've been enforced very differently in different areas. Now I happen to have lived in the US a couple of times and gone to school at two great universities there. And so I've also studied American competition policy and law a little bit, and it's fairly evident that the enforcement side on competition has not been very active in the US over the last few decades. So I don't really see this as a matter of sort of AI regulation. I see this as a matter of ensuring there's a fair marketplace, as there should be in any domain, where we ensure that no players become too big, either to fail, to refer to the financial crisis, or then sort of too big to have too much control, to dominate a market. And we've seen a lot of movement in Europe in this field. So the Digital Markets Act just entered into force, severely limiting the ability of platform companies to basically act as monopolies. Apple obviously being the obvious example with the App Store and the 30% fees. That is basically a tax on smaller companies. And so I do think there are a lot of things policymakers can do, and sort of monopolies, be them in tech or in poultry or farming, are bad inherently from the functioning of just a market and basically a free market, liberal market understanding.
So Patrick, your message to lawmakers is that there are existing rules, laws. The Federal Trade Commission has the ability from an antitrust, whether it's poultry or anything else. The only difference, Patrick, here is, and we saw this maybe about a week ago with Gemini, with some of the feedback, this has serious implications where we talk about the history of a country or countries and a generation getting knowledge and information. This is fine, maybe you get one kind of chicken, but this is about a complete indoctrination that could happen. So this is a very serious thing that our legislators and lawmakers need to pay attention to. Is what you're saying is we have laws on the books, but they need to be enforced. So that's a good point. Patrick, I want to turn to something which I find very, very interesting, and I want you to tell our listeners why, because one of the discussion points we've had from our guests from overseas is, and from even in the US, is that AI should not become basically an English language, Western or an American perspective. Your company has come out with large language model, or at least a model called Poro. And can you tell us a little bit about it, and also why was the Finnish language also chosen for that? Because I find that very, very interesting, and our listeners are really going to find why you chose that very, very interesting.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So poro is actually a Finnish word for reindeer.
Mhm.
So you can maybe, if you think about the names of some of the other models, you can maybe find a little bit of a joke there, referring perhaps to another reindeer-like animal. And I'll let the listeners figure out, sort of read between the lines here. So Poro is a 34 billion parameter large language model. It actually is not just in Finnish, it's also in English, and it's very capable in English, and also in about 9 programming languages, if I remember correctly. Now, it's very natural for us to start with Finnish. We're a company founded in Finland, and while we do operate internationally today and are located and have offices in many countries, both inside and outside of Europe, we're still a Finnish company by sort of culture and background. And I sit at our headquarters right now in beautiful Helsinki, Finland. Now, Finnish happens to have another quality that is interesting. Finnish is a very different language than all other European languages. So Finnish is actually part of what's called the Finno-Ugrian language family. So really the only other European languages close to Finnish is Estonian and Hungarian. And Hungarian is actually only really the syntax and the structure, not even the actual words. So Finnish is a great test case for what our hypothesis is. So basically, one of the things we're trying to do here at Silo is build large language models for what we call low resource languages. So languages with a limited amount of text data available for the model to be trained on. And our hypothesis was that by using certain technologies and certain approaches, you could anyways make the model very capable in these languages. And Finnish was sort of selected as the first one for the reasons I just mentioned. And we're very happy and very pleased with the results of Poro, which we completed a couple of weeks ago. And it actually shows, by far the best performance ever by a model in Finnish, but also very much state-of-the-art in English. And this was really the sort of proof point we were looking for. So now we're in the process of training models for all European or all official EU languages, which a lot of them are low resource languages. And this is really a part of, our last topic too. It's a way of ensuring that the countries, in this case, countries that are relatively speaking small, with small languages, also have access to technology, access to AI models that can operate in their own language in not just a way that is sort of correct grammatically, but also reflects the values and the culture of that region and of those countries. And I think that is something that is very much underappreciated, that if we rely solely on English data, which a lot of it is from the US, it's not just that it's the language per se, but language is really a reflection of our culture. It's a reflection of our values. So a lot of things get sort of coded through language. And unless we have models that can speak natively and are trained natively in these languages, there is a real risk that they sort of get lost in this next wave of innovation. And we're working hard to ensure that doesn't happen, which is also a reason why we wanted to open source the models, because that way people in Lithuania or people in Serbia can have access to large language model in their own language.
So you made a great point, Patrik, as you said, to keep the culture going, because that is a fear of countries in Africa, countries in different parts of Asia, as you said, small countries in Europe. Now, is your expectation, just because I find this topic very fascinating, maybe our listeners won't, but is your plan to take Poro into different European languages, or are you encouraging Estonia, Slovakia, and others to create their own large language models? What is your expectation, that they keep their culture and things like? What is Silo's role here?
So we are in the process of training models. They're likely not going to be called Poro, but we're training models both for the Nordic languages. So
it'll be reindeer in their languages. Just sorry.
Maybe we'll find another funny animal.
Okay.
But we have one coming for the Nordic languages, so Finnish, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Icelandic, and then one for all EU languages. So that's 23 official European Union languages. But we do have actually access to data for a bunch of additional languages as well. So this process starts from having high quality data in said language, and also well curated data, and then of course having the sort of technological prowess to also know how that actually fits into the model training process. But we're very much in the process of building these. We're doing it together with university partners, so they will be open source models, and we're super excited about seeing what type of innovations people will build on top of these base models. We're in that game as well. We're also doing that together with customers around the world. But that's the beauty of open source, right? Is you put it out there and things will start happening. And just we're 2 weeks in after having published the finished model, and there's already a bunch of sort of fine-tuning experiments that have been starting on it, and it's very exciting.
Very exciting indeed, Patrick, and congratulations on this venture. Patrick, shifting to the EU AI Act, as you know, a lot of work has happened. It's now on its way, hopefully in the next year or so, to get completely enacted. What are your thoughts when you look at it? Is it in its form sufficient, or do you think there is a need for further enhancement? Do you think it is, what are your thoughts on the EU AI Act?
Yeah, so I mean, I've followed the discussion very closely for the past few years, and the preparatory process. And as you mentioned, it very much looks like actually the European Parliament will vote on it next week, which would sort of finally have it enter into force. Which I think, from an industry point of view, that is good. We want predictability, so the sooner we can get to a solution, the better. I think that's sort of point number one, which is true, for any legislation in any industry. Now, when it comes to the specifics of the AI Act, the original architecture that was proposed is really something that we at Silo have supported even before that came out. So that was based on sort of the use cases of AI. It's not about regulating the technology per se, but about the use cases it gets used through. When it sort of touches consumers, at that touch point is when you regulate it. So you can think about an analogy from any product safety regulations, be it, water, food, something else, which is regulated to ensure that, no harmful outcomes happen at the consumer level. And we think that's the way to go about this. Then maybe to add to your listeners, it's use case, and then they create basically a risk categorization. So some use cases have higher risk, some have lower, and then depending on that, you have different requirements. Then during the process, of course, the ChatGPT moment happened. So there was a demand to also include regulation on foundational models, or what ended up being called general purpose AI models, GPAI for short. Now, that's a little bit of a trickier thing, because then you go from sort of a product safety regulation to actually regulating the core of the technology, which is a little bit different. Now, I've studied the Act, and I've talked to many people in Europe. We are absolutely sort of in support of both the spirit and the letter of the law. And while there are some open questions, especially pertaining to the GPAI requirements, we are confident that by summer 2025, when we will have to comply with them, they will be sorted out. We have a very constructive dialogue with the European Commission, and I'm sure we will get to a satisfactory situation with that. But I mean, it's also very important to mention that, this is the first time we're regulating AI as a technology. So there's a lot of things that's happening for the first time here. There are definitions that haven't existed in any EU law before. There are a lot of question marks that will inevitably only be solved by the European Court of Justice, so like a Supreme Court in the US. And that, of course, creates uncertainty. So I would really implore policymakers in other markets and other regions to sort of look at the AI Act and its basic infrastructure and try to emulate that. I think that's good, and that's the way it should happen. But also not sort of go down the path that I've heard some people talk about, which is sort of AI is a Wild West, or it's unregulated, because that's simply not true. I mean, AI is regulated. I think the US has 434 federal agencies, and pretty much every one of them has some rule that either directly or indirectly regulates AI. So be it in medicine development or in energy, finance, whatever. There are rules regarding algorithmic use and so on. which is really what AI is. So number one, it's not a Wild West. Number two, if you want to regulate, do it on a use case level.
So do it on a use case level. It's not a Wild West. Now, what people say, Patrick, is that EU AI Act goes horizontal. In the US, we are trying to go a little vertical by, as you said, maybe use case or by industry. Do you think, now obviously keep in mind, Patrick, you've lived in the US, so we are in an election year. Nothing's going to happen here. But if you were, our listeners are members of Congress, etc., what would be your suggestion to them? Going vertical by industry, is that something that they should be looking at versus what you have done in the EU?
So I was actually privileged to take part in the inaugural AI Insight Forum in the U.S. Senate last fall as part of my previous job. And I think the dialogue was actually, it surprised me by the level of how well aware people were of also the sort of risks of regulating. And I think, it's sometimes pictured as something maybe a little bit too binary, where either you go over regulation that kills innovation, or then you don't do any regulation. And as with most things, I think reality is more nuanced. So if I could sort of be an advisor to a policymaker in the US, I would say, look, it's pretty evident that technology and sort of the last wave of innovation, if we talk about mobile or social media, leaving that field completely unregulated was probably not the right way to go. There's a lot of sort of externalities stemming from especially social media that right now sort of individuals or society bears the cost of that. And I think, I'm a very sort of free market kind of guy. But in my mind, negative externalities caused by companies, they should also bear the burden of fixing those externalities. And right now it feels like the companies in social media, for example, have sort of gotten the benefit without paying the price. And I do think it's worth considering to avoid that mistake in this round of innovation. Now, then there are a lot of ideas and even bills in Congress floating around that would go very far. Very strict limitations on compute power, for example. I do think that's also a very dangerous road. So, every single new wave of technology, at least starting from the Industrial Revolution, has also caused a lot of consternation and a lot of fear. And somehow what has ended up happening is, the greatest creation of wealth ever in humankind by each sort of subsequent wave. So I'm very optimistic at the heart of this, that, we stand in front of some of the biggest challenges humankind has ever faced, be it climate change or, a polarizing world. We see, I live in a country with a 800-mile border with Russia. We see some of the threats very, very clearly here, and are very realistic about it. But what AI can do is also help us solve a lot of these problems. So we also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Be practical, seize the opportunity. Two follow-on questions on that. Lawmakers who come on our podcast say, hey, this technology is evolving so fast. I mean, Patrick, think about it. A year ago, a little over a year ago, large like ChatGPT came out. Then we've had multimodal come out. We've had agents come out. Now, all kinds of rumblings about AGI or super intelligence or those kinds of things. And look at how the memory windows have grown. How do policymakers, which, look at the EU AI Act, how long it has taken. How do they keep a draft policy that's going to keep in mind that this technology, and you're a key part of that with Silo AI, is evolving so fast that by the time they draft something, the technology could be way, way ahead here?
It's, Sanjay, it's a big challenge, and I don't want to pretend that it's not. I don't think it's in anyone's benefit to sort of simplify the situation. But I do subscribe very much to a sort of first principles approach also to legislation. I think it doesn't always apply only in physics, but we can also use it in the sort of human realm or in the societal realm. And what I would say is, keywords are sort of flexible, nimble, adaptable. I think we have to be able to adapt our way of legislating and creating policies to a new world. It's not just AI. The world's the sort of change of pace is only increasing, and it's only going to increase even further over the coming decades. So no matter if it's something as sort of regulating a fundamental technology like AI or a food safety regulation, they are going to have to be more adaptable to sort of emerging technology. So I do think there is room for policy innovation. There's room for innovation in mechanisms. But I would also, there are good examples of these type of things. The EU AI Act actually, it creates something called the EU AI Office, basically as part of the European Executive, part of the European Commission, similar to a US federal agency. And that will be a touch point for companies like us to have a very open stakeholder dialogue to actually try to together figure out what do these rules in practice on a company level, what do they mean? So I also think it's very much about a culture of a sort of a bureaucratic culture that is open to a dialogue, not just sort of listening to the lobbyists who have the most money, but actually, listening to companies at the forefront of innovation, not just taking their words. It's also listening to researchers and NGOs and others, but to have that open dialogue, because due to this breakneck speed of innovation, nobody can do this alone, be it a company or the government. And then maybe the last point on this, I would say, is everybody's fighting for AI talent now, and so should the government. So then the last part is really, how can the government recruit people with not just a technical understanding, but also that, but with an understanding of at the intersection of sort of technology, policy, law, national security, other aspects that are very central to this field. And so I would sort of implore governments around the world to really be ready to invest in this, because this is not a joke, and I think it's very generally known that AI talent is fairly sought after at this point. And that would also mean things that are usually very politically difficult. But things like, ensuring the salaries are high enough to be able to recruit top level talent. And I think this is where we might also have to become a little bit innovative on the public sector side.
As usual, you made some great points, if I can follow up on that. One is, as you said, governments should listen to many different stakeholders, obviously not just lobbyists, but innovative companies, academics, researchers, and others, which I think is very important. We bring in, civil society groups, we bring in advocacy groups, we bring in educators, ethics experts for our government folks to listen to. The other thing you said was, which is part of the Biden White House, executive order, is the talent issue. And you said governments need to beef up or need to shore up their talent, and that means paying them great salaries. Now, the executive order that the OMB also has passed is they've changed some of the salary structure, and they've also tried to make some of the immigration policies great. You have, you just mentioned up front, you have 300 plus people in AI. That's like, our listeners are thinking, wow, that's a lot of great AI talent. Not that this has anything to do about regulation, but AI talent. And then I'll come to the flip side of that is, what is the secret of being able to not just hiring, but keeping? Because I'm sure that every AI company is looking at Silo AI and its employees and saying to them, hey, we'll pay you a lot more. Why don't you come to us? But for governments around the world, as you said, they need to invest in AI, but they need to invest in the talent, whether you are a government in Africa, you're a government in Asia, Latin America, South America. But what have you been able to do so that our listeners in these countries know how to do that?
So I mean, I think it's very general or generic sort of issues, right? I mean, it starts from having an interesting job, being able to do cool things at the forefront of innovation, at really, I would even say, before the forefront. I mean, some of the things I watch are amazing, tech team and R&D teams work on. It blows me away on a daily basis, especially as someone with a non-technical background. I barely understand what I see on their screens. And then when they tell me what they can do, it's amazing. And it's one of the biggest inspirations in my life that I'm super excited about, to just be able to work with some of these great minds. Now how we do it, in addition to obviously trying to ensure that people have interesting jobs and interesting tasks and get to work on hard problems, because smart people want to work on hard problems. And being at the forefront of innovation, we're very lucky in Finland, and I think in Europe actually more broadly. We have a great university system that is also very accessible. We have in Finland, for EU membership, EU citizens, education is free up until a PhD, but it's very high level. So we have multiple universities in Finland that really keep producing great AI talent. It's actually a general misconception that exists in large parts of the AI community, that Europe doesn't have AI talent. It's actually a lot of the best AI talent in the world stem from Europe. I mean, you can look at Hugging Face, their entire founding quartet, they're all European.
Yep.
They did found their company in the US, and that's a problem from a European competitiveness point of view, which
Yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't issues. Meta, their AI team, led by the Frenchman Yann LeCun, and a lot of his team members are French. So, and these are just some examples. Google DeepMind, located in London. These are great European talents in this space. So I'm actually super optimistic about both Silo's future, but also about Europe's future more broadly in the AI space. And I think it all starts from those two things. I mean, you need to have a great education system that gives people that are interested and inspired the opportunity to learn and apply themselves. And then you need to provide them with challenging, interesting tasks.
So for our policymakers around the world, invest in great academic institutions that are maybe focused on AI, but AI broadly. One of the points Patrik made was it's not just machine learning, it needs to be ethics, it needs to be policy, it needs to be legal, a multidisciplinary approach to AI. Patrik, now let me take the other side of the workforce issue. There have been a lot of reports, McKinsey, IMF say, etc., saying there is going to be massive job displacement, especially white collar, programming folks, marketing folks, call center folks, and numbers up to 60%, etc. Legislators who are looking at this as saying, forget 60%, if there's a 30% job displacement, how do they do it? I understand people say, hey, it'll create many new opportunities, etc. But for the people who are caught in between this transition, it's not great to hear, hey, there's going to be many more opportunities, but you're not the one who's going to get those opportunities. There'll be somebody else. What would, as somebody who's representing a company who's got a successful employee base, and you're looking at what has happened, your thoughts on this transformation? Will this transformation happen with job displacement? That's number one. And what should legislators do about it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is, as you mentioned, I think you described the phenomenon very well. It's not a problem-free development. And I think people in the technology industry sometimes sort of brush over this point and say, look, all previous sort of innovation cycles have had some externalities, but generally speaking, we've been better off. Now, I mean, I kind of take both sides of this argument because I am a big believer in innovation, and I do think it's very important. I'm looking at this from Europe, where we have a quickly aging population. We have super big challenges with sort of public finances, with overall productivity of the economy. And AI can play a huge part in not necessarily solving the whole equation, but at least getting us somewhere there. And I think you can look at this on an individual level, I think everybody who's used any of these, large language model based products out there can see how that has made them more productive in one way or another. And this is just the very tip of the iceberg. This is just the sort of the really, really early stages. So I think sort of I take the optimist view of this being basically, so amazing of a technology with so much potential benefit that we just have to go down this road. We cannot. The cost of not doing it is even higher. So I think that's point number one. Then point number two is I think we somehow have a tendency to always get stuck in sort of, we're talking about AI, we want to put everything under the AI policy umbrella. And maybe this is, in my opinion, a little bit analogous to the point I made about competition policy. Look, there are absolutely negative externalities, or at least the potential of them. But I think that's a social policy. That's a labor policy issue. We should absolutely make sure we have upskilling programs. We should absolutely make sure we have retraining programs, government funded such. And we should absolutely make sure that the people, be they marketing people or whoever else, that might lose their jobs as a result of AI, or at least indirectly, that they can have access to retraining. I think that's in everybody's interest. But I do want to make the point that has been made in a lot of AI conversations over the last year. Look, I think in the short term, AI is not going to take your job or my job, but a person using AI and being really adept at using AI might do that. So I do implore everyone, are they young, old, living anywhere in the world, start using this technology, start playing around with it, and learn of its potential, because it will only make you more efficient in your job.
So according to Patrik, AI is not coming for a job in the immediate, but if you are using AI, you're going to be more efficient than the one who is not. So better start using AI no matter which part of the world you are in or what job you are doing, whether you're young, old, whatever you are. And that's a great message. Patrik, do you think the EU has done its AI Act? UK's got the whole safety thing. US is got over 100 bills in Congress. You attended some of the listening sessions Senator Schumer has had. Do you believe that there needs to be international collaboration in shaping an AI, maybe some kind of an AI regulation around the world? And do you think the Chinese also need to be involved in these discussions?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, Sanjay. I mean, in an ideal world, I would of course prefer us to, all major economies and smaller ones as well, to coordinate the rules on AI. I think, harmonized rules would benefit, of course, companies, be easier to operate in different regions if you sort of have one set of rules, like we actually do have in some areas. I think a lot of skeptics of multilateralism sometimes don't realize that we do have a lot of international rules pertaining to, for example, to trade, or even stuff like transport that actually is coordinated on a UN level to a large extent. So I think that's my point number one. I do think there is room for multilateralism, and of course that benefits everybody from companies to actually individuals as well. Now, it's likely unrealistic that this will happen, at least in the medium term, that we'll have exactly the same rules. But the more we can coordinate, the more the European Union and the US and China and African countries and South American countries can coordinate, the better it just will be for everyone involved. So that's why I'm cautiously optimistic about both the G20 process, the Hiroshima process that was started last year, but also about initiatives within the UN framework and the OECD framework, looking at sort of very strategic level frameworks. Because if we can even have similar frameworks, that already helps companies. So when I, for example, when I look at the EU AI Act and the executive order from the Biden administration, I mean, there are clear correlations there.
Mhm.
Structurally and architecturally, they're very similar. They end up with different parameters and different sort of limitations here and there and different requirements, but structurally, they're very similar. So when I create a compliance plan together with my team for our company, you know, yes, the input in the Excel is a little bit different in the US and Europe, but the structure actually is pretty much the same. So I already see benefits of the fact that I know that the US and the EU has cooperated on this. And I do hope that whoever gets elected in the US next fall, that this part of international collaboration that really benefits everyone and doesn't really cost anything is continued.
So what Patrick's message to our listeners is international collaboration is important because it gives certainty to companies and entrepreneurs and innovators. And he sees already some level of collaboration between EU Act and the executive order. And that could also, he's hopeful that other countries, other large economies around the world can collaborate because it would be beneficial for everybody. It's not just EU, but for everybody. Patrik, your company is, plays a very important role in Europe. We have listeners from Europe who are building startups, and this is not about regulation per se, but these are entrepreneurs, especially AI related, who are doing MLOps, etc. What would be just briefly some advice that you would give to some of the smaller companies developing AI in Europe?
Thank you. I think this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because at heart I'm an optimist. So I think my number one message would just be go for it. This we talked about this earlier, but AI is in many ways the great equalizer and sort of democratizer. A lot of people, myself, I haven't written code in 20 years and I'm very bad at it. But now for the last year, I've played around with large language models and I realized that with the help of some of these tools, I'm actually able to create software. That was something that was not accessible to me before. And I think I'm not the only one in this position. So I think not just to entrepreneurs who already, are in the field, but to people, I don't know, stuck in a job they might not love a lot or studying something that they, might have chosen the wrong field. The world is even more your oyster today than it was 2 years ago. So play around with these tools, let your creativity flow, go out there, try, fail, try again. I'm a big fan of many parts of the American culture. And one part that I've always been amazed at is the entrepreneurial spirit that is evident not just in Silicon Valley, but around the country. I've lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts myself, and I've seen the amazing innovation that flows around, the biotech sector and other sectors in that area. I think this spirit, this culture is something I wish, more Europeans would sort of try to live. And I have to say, my final point on this topic, I actually see a lot more of that in a younger generation. We see such excitement around, for example, in Finland, the startup ecosystem here. We have an annual conference called Slush in November, really the darkest part of the year. And, it's 10,000 people come in and you see all these amazing, everything from like a 19-year-old founder who just, skipped college or jumped out after the first semester to like a 60-year-old person who's worked in a business for 30 years and decided, you know what, I want to try my hand at this. And my message is go for it, take the risk. It's very rarely not worth it. And failure is part of being a human and part of growing. And I really, I'm trying to live that myself as well. So I encourage people to go out there and take more risks.
Well, for our listeners in Europe, I think Patrik's message is be like Nike, just do it. That's what Patrik is saying. And the other message he's telling you all is AI is a big equalizer. You don't need to be a programmer to program. And if you're frustrated in a job, this is your opportunity. And the startup ecosystem that he believes embodies US now for the younger generation in Europe can really be the beginning. This could be the transformative thing that would unleash an entrepreneurial ecosystem, Patrik. Patrik, Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, learned a lot about the European ecosystem, learned about some of the things that Silo is doing, your views on regulation, legislation, etc. Any final words for our audience on the United States side? You've given them some good pieces of advice. Any final pieces of advice for them?
So, I don't want to be arrogant enough to tell people what to do in the US, but maybe a last word that I can say is, I've as a natural born Finn who's lived most of my life in Finland, but moved to the US 2 times over because I enjoyed it so much. I just would send a message to Americans of like, you have done so much right, and you've been a beacon for democracy and free markets around the world. And I would just implore you guys to keep being that, because I do think you've played an important role on the global scene. And as someone who has a background in both technology but also in security policy, I do really see that as a fundamental and important role to advance values that I think both Europe and America shares, like human rights and democracy, and really, really foundational things like this. So I do hope that your innovative spirit continues, and I do hope that this sort of the global productive role that your country has had ever since World War II also continues.
So continue to be the beacon to the rest of the world with global innovation. Patrik, is your thought process. Thank you so much, Patrik. We've taken a lot of your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's been an absolute pleasure.